In the chaos of a region on fire, with missiles flying over Tehran and warships shifting silently across the Persian Gulf, something unexpected happened, not on the battlefield, but on a secure satellite line bouncing through encrypted networks. The supreme leader of Iran, under siege and reeling from cyber attacks that had blinded large swaths of his defense systems, didn't call Moscow. He didn't call Beijing. He called Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso, small, landlocked, often overlooked. But at that moment, the most volatile axis in the world pointed south. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, wasn't expecting the call. He was in a closed military briefing, fielding reports of strange drone activity and disinformation campaigns sweeping through his country. Then came the knock, a red handset, a silent aid, and a conversation that could reshape continents. What followed was not a negotiation. It wasn't about missiles or aid. It was about recognition. Iran, long treated as a pariah, was asking not for weapons, but for solidarity, from a continent too often invited only when resources were needed, never when voices mattered. In that moment, a proposition emerged: what if Africa, for once, chose its own side, not east, not west, but sovereign? This is the story of how a single phone call forced the world to look where it had long refused, at the power rising from the margins. It's a story of leadership under pressure, of symbolic acts becoming strategic pivots, and of what happens when the long-ignored decide to speak, not for others, but for themselves. And it all began not with a missile, but with a message. It began without warning. In the dead of night, Israeli warplanes launched a series of precision strikes deep into Iranian territory. The targets weren't symbolic, they were strategic: nuclear research facilities, military communication hubs, and suspected missile launch sites. The operation, planned in silence, executed with ruthless efficiency, sent shockwaves through global capitals. Within the first hour, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appeared on national television. His message was clear, unambiguous: Iran's nuclear ambitions will not go unchecked. We have taken action. The world froze. In Washington, the White House remained silent. No press conference. No presidential statement. But American warships in the Persian Gulf began quietly repositioning, closer, tighter, within striking distance. It was a message of readiness, not reassurance. Oil prices surged. Markets panicked. News anchors stumbled over themselves trying to piece together facts faster than they were unfolding. But the real storm was happening in the shadows. Across Iraq and Syria, Iranian-aligned militias began retaliating. American bases came under rocket fire. Explosions in the green zone of Baghdad lit up the night sky. The region was being dragged into a new inferno. And it was just the beginning. But inside Iran, something even more dangerous was happening. As emergency meetings unfolded in Tehran's fortified bunkers, generals were not just concerned with the missiles, they were stunned by what had accompanied them. A coordinated wave of cyber attacks had struck moments before the physical assault. Iranian radar systems were jammed. Communication links between regional outposts went dead. Air defense networks flickered into blindness. It was more than a strike, it was a systemic ambush. And Tehran knew, it wasn't just Israel. No single nation could pull this off alone. Somewhere, someone had coordinated a wider digital war front. Suspicion turned into certainty: this was the work of a coalition, even if unnamed. And Iran's most powerful allies, Russia, China, were quiet, cautious, unwilling to escalate. Tehran was encircled. Isolated. But far from defeated. With the traditional doors of power closing, Iran turned somewhere no one expected. Not up, but south. And in that moment, as satellites spun overhead and military analysts scrambled for answers, the most consequential conversation of the war was about to begin. In the depths of an underground command center in Tehran, while air raid sirens still echoed in the distance, a secure satellite phone lit up. It wasn't routed to Moscow. It didn't seek reassurances from Beijing. Instead, the encrypted signal traveled a different route, hopping across 3 military-grade satellites until it landed in the presidential compound of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré was in a classified briefing with his generals when the knock came. A senior aide entered, face grave, holding a secure red handset. No words were needed. The tension in the room shifted immediately. Traoré took the call without hesitation. On the other end, the voice was calm, deep, deliberate. It was the supreme leader of Iran. President Traoré, he said. Iran stands on the edge. They want us to fall. Because if we do, Africa is next. The room went silent, not from fear, but from calculation. Every word spoken from that point forward would echo far beyond the walls of that chamber. This wasn't just a plea, it was a geopolitical pivot. But Traoré didn't flinch. He listened. And then he answered, not with obedience, but with clarity. You speak of shared struggle, he said, but where was Iran when the Sahel bled under colonial knives? There was a pause on the line. A silence heavy with history. Still, Traoré continued, today is not about yesterday. It is about power. And today, you call because you know Africa's voice can no longer be ignored. He didn't agree. He didn't reject. He reframed the entire conversation. If we are to stand with you, it must be public. No backroom understandings. The world must see Iran recognize Africa as an equal. On the other side, the Iranian leader understood the stakes. This wasn't just about seeking support. It was about offering respect. About rebalancing power in plain view of a world long skewed by old empires. The supreme leader responded with a single sentence, then let the world see. And so it began, not a transaction, but a transformation. Less than an hour after the call ended, Burkina Faso's defense ministry received a secure data transmission, encrypted files sent directly from Tehran. No press releases. No formal agreement. Just raw, unfiltered intelligence. What lay within those documents would shake Traoré's inner circle to the core. Among the files was satellite imagery confirming the existence of a French-operated drone base inside Niger, one that Paris had publicly denied existed. Surveillance logs tracked the flight paths of drones that had violated Burkina Faso's airspace even after French forces were formally expelled. Even more unsettling were digital fingerprints. Israeli cyber signatures embedded deep within the code of malware used to attack West African government servers. The same kind of disinformation campaigns and network disruptions Traoré had been briefed about just hours earlier were now traceable. They hadn't just arrived, they had been planted. And then came the transcripts. Intercepted NATO communications casually discussed containment strategies for Sahelian states. Phrases like manage sovereignty aspirations and preemptive disruption were used without shame. It was no longer speculation. The war had already crossed into Africa, not with boots, but with bytes and drones and deals struck in foreign tongues. Inside the presidential compound, disbelief turned to anger. What was once framed as distant geopolitics was now an intimate threat. Traoré didn't wait for further validation. He ordered an immediate ban on all Western military flights over Burkina Faso's airspace. Emergency encrypted messages were dispatched to leaders in Mali and Niger. Within hours, a regional summit was called. The agenda was stark and urgent: regional survival. But even as military leaders coordinated logistics, something bigger was forming. The idea wasn't just to respond. It was to reposition. For decades, Africa had been used as a chessboard. But now, a different move was emerging, a new alliance. Not of the East. Not of the West. But of those left out of both. Traore wasn't just reacting, he was redefining. And the shock waves of that redefinition were about to ripple far beyond the Sahel. The Western media wasted no time. Within 24 hours, headlines across Europe and the United States exploded: Burkina Faso aligns with Iran. Analysts debated whether this marked the start of a new anti-Western bloc or was merely a reckless provocation. Think tanks issued urgent reports, warning of destabilizing alignments and rogue diplomacy. But while policymakers scrambled to frame the narrative, something entirely different was unfolding on the ground. In the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Conakry, thousands began chanting Traoré's name. Handmade posters showed his face beside phrases like, "We will not kneel," and "Africa will decide." Across social media platforms, clips of Traoré's quiet defiance went viral, especially the line, "Today is not about yesterday. It is about power." The speech he delivered, broadcast from a modest podium to a continent and then the world, wasn't polished diplomacy. It was raw, direct, and unapologetically sovereign. "Burkina Faso does not choose war," he said. "But we choose justice. And when the oppressed call, we answer, not as tools, but as equals." The message was immediately rebroadcast by Iran's national television network. Across the Middle East, it struck a chord. In nations long isolated by Western sanctions or targeted by covert interventions, Traoré's image became a symbol of rare courage, from the global periphery, but speaking with global weight. In Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu responded swiftly. In a press conference, he dismissed Traoré's remarks as dangerous ignorance, and warned that those who side with our enemies will face consequences. But this time, the threat didn't land with the same thunder. The world was changing. And the old lines, drawn by military power and financial dominance, were being crossed not by weapons, but by words. Traoré hadn't launched a missile. He had launched a message. And messages, when timed right and spoken clearly, can crack foundations. The West had underestimated the symbolic strength of standing alone. Now, it feared the far greater power of standing together. As missiles still flew over Tehran and drones buzzed across the Red Sea, a quieter yet equally powerful shift was underway. This time, not in the skies, but across diplomatic halls and strategy rooms in Africa. Inside the African Union, murmurs began turning into private discussions. Delegates from various nations, some cautious, some curious, started exploring an idea long considered fringe: the formation of a non-aligned counterweight bloc. Not pro-Iran. Not anti-West. Simply pro-Africa. Old alliances came under scrutiny. Presidents who had long voted in step with Western agendas at the United Nations now faced rising pressure from their own citizens. In Dar es Salaam, students marched holding signs that read, "Burkina stood up. What about us?" In Johannesburg, university panels debated whether Africa should continue supporting Western resolutions that ignored African interests. It wasn't just sentiment, it was strategic recalibration. And it wasn't just the people, it was the power structure itself shifting. China and Russia, usually eager to capitalize on Western missteps, remained cautious. They didn't openly endorse Traoré's actions, but neither did they criticize him. Instead, they praised his sovereign decision-making, a diplomatic nod without entanglement. Western governments, meanwhile, scrambled. State departments issued vague warnings about regional destabilization. Intelligence agencies expanded surveillance across the Sahel. But none of it addressed the core issue. Africa was no longer being spoken for. It was speaking for itself. And for the first time in decades, that voice was not reacting to crisis, it was redefining its role in the crisis. Weeks passed. No formal treaties were signed. No military alliance was declared. No weapons exchanged hands. Yet the world had already changed. Iran, though bruised, stood unbroken. Israel had proven its reach, but not its deterrence. The United States hesitated, unwilling to commit to a full-scale intervention. And somewhere in between the two poles of global influence, Africa had risen. Not as a battlefield, but as a voice. Ibrahim Traoré had not launched a missile. He had launched a moment. And that moment did something military campaigns rarely accomplish: it shifted the narrative. For decades, Africa had been the world's silent partner, courted for resources, sidelined in diplomacy. But when war knocked on the global door once more, it was an African leader who answered. Not with fear, not with submission, but with a question: what if we chose ourselves? Across embassies, analysts scrambled to update briefings. Western think tanks published emergency reports. But on the ground, in corners often dismissed as irrelevant, people felt something they hadn't in generations: a reason to believe. Not in Iran. Not in Israel. Not even in war. But in the idea that power is not inherited. It is declared. And once declared, it must be defended, not just with force, but with wisdom, courage, and timing. In a world split between old empires, someone had spoken from the center. And the world was listening. If this story challenged your view of global power, share it. Let others see what happens when those long ignored begin to lead. Coming up next, what happens when Africa builds its own internet? Join us as we explore the Sahel's digital rebellion. In the dusty alleyways of Bamako, under the shade of makeshift market stalls, voices once subdued began to rise. Not with anger, but with conviction. On walls freshly painted with revolutionary graffiti, one phrase repeated over and over: Nous décidons maintenant, we decide now. Across the continent, something intangible but undeniable had begun to shift. It wasn't directed by diplomats or generals. It was born from street corners, university halls, WhatsApp groups, radio stations in remote villages, and songs sung by griots who remembered the pain of past betrayals. Africa was finding its voice, not as a single chant, but as a chorus of awakening. In Ghana, young organizers held teach-ins on non-alignment, referencing not just Iran or Israel, but Lumumba, Sankara, Nkrumah, the visionaries whose voices had been silenced before their time. In Nigeria, campus debates erupted over whether the country should continue voting with Western powers at the United Nations. Students asked out loud what their parents had only whispered: when do we stop echoing others and start writing our own story? In South Africa, a Zulu elder on live radio compared Traoré's stand to that of Nelson Mandela's first speech from prison. We thought we needed to pick a side. But this young man reminded us, we can be our own. In Dakar, a fisherman with no formal education called into a popular political show and said, if they fear our voice, it means our voice matters. We must not stay silent anymore. Even religious leaders, often cautious and diplomatic, began shifting tone. In a church in Kinshasa, a priest told his congregation, God gave us land and wisdom. What we do with it now will decide our children's tomorrow. In a mosque in Niamey, an imam preached unity not just among Muslims, but among African nations. The internet, once seen as a threat to unity, became a weapon of empowerment. Memes emerged showing Traore seated between African heroes of past generations. TikTok videos remixed his speech into hip-hop anthems. A viral audio clip of a mother in Nairobi crying while watching his UN address was shared millions of times. "He sounds like us," she said. "He speaks what we've wanted to say for years." This wasn't blind support for Iran, far from it. Many Africans remained skeptical of Tehran's intentions. What they embraced was not the alliance, but the autonomy. The courage to say no to the status quo. To demand respect without needing to kneel for it. More than one elder said, "This war is not ours, but the silence would have cost us more." In rural Burkina Faso, a village chief who had fought during the colonial resistance era gathered his community and said, "When I was young, we were told our voices didn't matter. Today, the world is listening. Don't whisper, shout." What began as a military flare-up in the Middle East had ignited something deeper, a political awakening rooted in generations of silenced wisdom. And this time, the world was watching. Africa was no longer the continent where history happened to it. It was becoming the place where history was shaped. And perhaps most profoundly, it was not shaped through war, but through words. Through a leader who listened before he spoke. Through people who saw themselves not as pawns, but as architects of something new. Not East. Not West. Just Africa.